As you probably have started to figure out by now, the real history of the United States is much more complicated than some history books would have you believe. One important part of this darker side of U.S. history is the United States' actions in Central America, beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. During the presidencies of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. began to practice a new kind of foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. It presented itself as the protector of other nations in the Americas from intervention by European countries, yet its reasons were very self-serving. Though it did not involve active colonies or colonial governments like European countries had done before, this new form of imperialism enabled the United States to influence the economies of neighboring countries and establish systems that worked in the U.S.'s favor, many of which are still in place today. Some key locations for this that you more likely have heard of are Cuba and Puerto Rico, yet while these histories of U.S. intervention in Central America themselves are often left out of U.S. history, I want to focus this video on the even lesser known but incredibly significant story of the United States meddling in Panama. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land with sea on either side that forms a link between two larger areas of land. And you can see in this picture here how Panama itself is on the isthmus between North America and South America. Before the Panama Canal was built through this isthmus, which was a process that took 11 years and finished in 1914, cargo ships had to go around the southern tip of South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. At this point in time, the Suez Canal in Egypt had already been in use as an important pathway for ships to more quickly pass from Europe to Asia, which served as an example of how isthmus trade routes had the potential to revolutionize global trade. The United States understood the economic power that would come with having control over such a new major trade route in the Americas, and it was already conveniently knee-deep in Central American affairs after the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War of 1898. A good entry point for learning about the United States meddling in Panama is these two primary documents from November 1903, which was the month when Panama declared itself an independent nation from Colombia. Though any United States intervention in Panama's revolution was certainly indirect, both documents suspiciously follow a series of unsuccessful negotiations about building a canal between the U.S. and Colombia in the years leading up to the revolution. The first document is a letter from President Roosevelt to the editor of a prominent monthly journal. In this letter, the president's purpose is clear as he works to convince this journalist that he was not responsible for Panama's revolution. He writes, "I did not foment the revolution in the Isthmus, and as you know from my previous correspondence with you, it is idle folly to speak of there having been a conspiracy." This letter comes at a time when people back in the U.S. were beginning to speculate that the United States had influenced and aided Panama's revolution against Colombian rule because of the interest in the canal. Especially considering the fact that this last major push for the canal lined up conveniently with Roosevelt's campaign for re-election, it is important to understand the limits of this source in terms of reliability. Over the past century, historians such as Richard Turk have analyzed the United States' role in Panama's independence and found evidence that brings the truth of Roosevelt's claim into question. Although it may not be reliable, we still can learn a lot from the way that Roosevelt attempts to frame his story in writing to someone whose position as editor gave him a lot of power in shaping the narrative around happenings in Panama, and by extension, influencing Roosevelt's chances at re-election. This document pairs well with another primary source that was written a few weeks later and outlines agreements between the United States and Panama regarding the construction of the Panama Canal. In the document, the U.S. recognizes Panama's independence from Colombia with the caveat that the U.S. will now have perpetual use, occupation, and control over the land where the canal will be built, in addition to neighboring islands. Through ratifying Panama's independence, the United States claims sovereign control over a very important section of the isthmus. In analyzing these two primary documents, which are both produced by President Roosevelt during a tumultuous year in Panama, we could gain an understanding of how the United States used its influence to gain economic power at the expense of meddling in other countries' affairs. Despite the narrative that the president attempted to emphasize surrounding these events, what happened in Panama is part of a larger pattern of United States economic interventions in Central America during this period. As the world moved into the 20th century, the United States was only just picking up steam in what would become an even farther-reaching series of campaigns and policies that established a new kind of economic empire in the Americas and the world beyond. Many of these policies are still in effect today. Thanks for watching my video. Here are some of the sources I used if you're interested in looking more into this topic.